Hi everybody! Welcome to another Storytime with Sid. It is me, Sidney of Hightower, of course. And here we have for you today another story for Storytime with Sid. Because that's why you're here, I hope. Or you're here to look at my face, which is also fine. I like my face. Pretty happy with it. But let's get to the story. So I took a look, and I think I like the idea of planning what I'm going to read instead of randomly looking at it. Even so, I still haven't read this story in particular. This is called The Shadow, and I thought it was really interesting. So, it's time to read The Shadow. Okay, let's get started. In the hot countries, the sun is certainly scorching. People turn as brown as mahogany. But it was to one of the moderately hot countries that a learned man had just come from the cold lands. There he thought he could run around just as he did back home, but he soon discovered otherwise. He and all sensible people had to stay indoors. The shutters and doors stayed closed all day long. The whole building seemed to be asleep, or else no one was home. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The whole building seemed to be asleep, or else no one was home. Again. The narrow street, with the tall buildings where he lived, was also laid out, so that it was flooded with sunlight from morning to evening. It was truly quite unbearable. The learned man from the cold countries, he was a young man, a clever man, felt like he was sitting in a blazing oven. It took a toll on him. He grew quite thin, and even his shadow shrank. It was smaller than it was back home. The sun took a toll on it too. Neither of them livened up until the evening when the sun went down. That was a real pleasure to see. As soon as a candle was brought into the room, the shadow would stretch all the way up the wall, while it would even go along the ceiling. It made himself so long. It had to stretch out to regain its strength. The learned man would go out to the balcony to stretch himself there, and as the stars appeared in the lovely clear sky, he seemed to come back to life. On all the balconies along the street, and in the warm countries, every window has a balcony, people appeared, because they have to have air, even if they were used to being so tan. Everything grew quite lively, both upstairs and down. Shoemakers and tailors, everybody moved into the street. Tables and chairs appeared, and candles burned. Over 1,000 candles were burning, and one person would talk while the other sang. People strolled, carriages rolled past, mules walked along with a cling-a-ling because they were wearing bells. Bodies were buried with hymns, street urchins set off firecrackers, and the church bells rang. Oh yes, it was very lively down in the street. Only one building, which stood right across from where the learned stranger was staying, was completely silent. Yet someone did live there, because there were flowers on the balcony. They grew so wondrously in the heat of the sun, and that would be impossible unless they were watered, and someone must have watered them. People had to be living there. The door across the way also stood ajar in the evening, but it was dark inside, at least in the front room. From farther inside came the sound of music. The learned stranger thought the music was quite marvelous, but it could also be that he was imagining things because he found everything in the warm countries to be marvelous. If only there weren't so much sun. The stranger's landlord said he didn't know who had rented the neighbor's house. He hadn't seen anyone, after all, and as for the music, he thought it was awfully dreary. It sounds like someone is sitting there and practicing a piece he can't figure out. Always the same tune. I'm gonna get it right, he's probably saying, but he never does, no matter how much he plays. One night, the stranger awoke as he slept in front of the open balcony door. The drapes lifted with the wind, and he thought a peculiar glow was coming from the neighbor's balcony. All the flowers were gleaming like flames in the loveliest colors. In the midst of the flowers stood a slender, enchanting maiden, and she seemed to be glowing too. It actually hurt his eyes. Now he opened them as wide as he possibly could and roused himself from sleep. In a single bound he was on the floor. Very quietly he moved behind the drapes. But the maiden was gone, and the glow was too. The flowers weren't shining at all, but stood there just as nicely as they always did. The door was ajar, and from inside came the sound of music so gentle and lovely that it prompted the sweetest of thoughts. Yet it was like a spell. And who lived there? Where was the real entrance? The whole ground floor was one shop after another, and people couldn't be constantly running through them. One evening, the stranger was sitting out in his balcony. In the room behind him, a candle burned, so it was quite natural for his shadow to go over to the neighbor's wall. Yet it sat across the way amid the flowers in the balcony, and wherever the stranger moved, the shadow moved too, because that's what a shadow does. "I think my shadow is the only living thing to be seen over there," said the learned man. "Look how nicely it's sitting among the flowers. The door is ajar. If only my shadow would be clever enough to go inside and take a look around, then come and tell me what it saw. Yes, you'd be doing me a service," he said in jest. "Please step aside. Are you going or not?" Then nodded to his shadow, and the shadow nodded back. "All right, go on, but don't get lost." The stranger stood up, and over the neighbor's balcony the shadow stood up too. The stranger turned, and his shadow turned too. Why, if anyone had been paying proper attention, he would have clearly seen the shadow go inside the half-open balcony door into the neighbor's house, just as the stranger went inside his own room, letting the long drapes fall behind him. The next morning, the learned man went out to drink his coffee and read the papers. "What's this?" he said, as he stepped out into the sunshine. "I don't have any shadow. So it really must have gone over there last night. It hasn't come back. How tedious that is." He was annoyed, not so much because the shadow was gone, but because he knew there was another story about a man without a shadow. Everyone back home in the cold countries knew about it, and if the learned man now came home to tell his own story, they would say he was just copying another one and he shouldn't bother. So he decided not to say anything about it because that was sensible. In the evening he went back out to his balcony. He had placed the candle quite rightly behind him, for he knew that a shadow always wants to have its master as a screen, but he couldn't lure it out. He made himself small. He made himself big. But there was no shadow. None appeared. He said, and that was it. But it did no good. It was annoying, but in the warm countries, everything grows very quickly. After a week had passed, he noticed, to his great delight, that a new shadow had begun to grow outward from his feet wherever he was out in the sun. The roots must have stayed with him. After 3 weeks, he had quite an acceptable shadow, which he set off for home in the northern countries, grew bigger and bigger during the journey, until at last it was twice as big and twice as long as it should be. Then the learned man arrived home. He wrote books about what was true in the world and about what was good and what was beautiful, and days passed into years. Many years passed. Then one evening he was sitting in his parlor and he heard a faint knock on the door. "Come in," he said, but no one did. Then he opened the door, and before him stood an exceedingly thin person that he was quite taken aback. And incidentally, the person was so remarkably well dressed, he had to be a distinguished man. "With whom do I have the honor of speaking?" asked the learned man. "Oh, I thought as much," said the elegant man. "You don't recognize me. I've become so solid that I've acquired real flesh and clothing. You probably never thought you'd see me in such top form. Don't you even recognize your old shadow? Well, I suppose you thought I'd never come back. Things have gone exceptionally well for me since I was last with you. I've become quite a wealthy man in every respect. If I have to buy my freedom from service, I can." And then he jingled a whole bundle of precious seals that hung from his watch, and he stuck his hand under the thick gold chain that he wore around his neck. Oh, how his fingers glittered with gold rings, and everything was genuine. "I can't believe my eyes," said the learned man. "What is all this?" "Well, it's definitely not something ordinary," said the shadow. "But then you're not an ordinary man, as you know. I've been following in your footsteps ever since childhood. As soon as you found that I was mature enough to go out into the world alone, I went my own way. And now I find myself in the most splendid of circumstances. But a sense of longing came over me to see you again before you die. You are going to die, you know. I also wanted to see these regions again because a person is always fond of his homeland. I know that you have a new shadow. Do I owe anything to it or to you? Please tell me if I do." "Oh, is it really you?" said the learned man. "This is highly unusual. I never would have believed that a person's old shadow could come back to a human being." "Tell me what I have to pay you," said the shadow, "because I don't want to be indebted to you in any way." "How can you say that?" said the learned man. "What kind of debt are you talking about? You're as free as anyone. I'm extremely happy that you found your good fortune. Sit down, old friend, and just tell me a little about all this that happened and what you saw over at the neighbor's house back in the warm countries." "All right, I'll tell you," said the shadow, sitting down. "But then you have to promise me that you'll never tell anyone here in town, no matter where you met me, that I was once your shadow. I'm thinking about getting engaged. I'm able to support more than my own family." "Never fear," said the learned man. "I won't tell anyone who you really are. Here's my hand. I promise. And a man is true to his word." "A word is true to its shadow," said the shadow, and of course that was the way it had to talk. Yet it was quite remarkable how much of a human being it had become. The shadow was well dressed, all in black, made from the finest of black cloth, with patent leather boots, and a top hat that could be snapped closed so only the crown and brim remained. To say nothing of what we had already know he was wearing, seals, a gold chain, and diamond rings. Oh yes, the shadow was exceptionally well dressed, and that was exactly what made him a human being. I don't think clothes make you a human being, but then again, to each their own. No doubt he wanted to find out how it could win its freedom and become its own master. "Do you know who was living in the neighbor's house?" said the shadow. "It was the most lovely creature of all. It was poetry. I was there for 3 weeks, and that had as a great effect as if I had lived there 3,000 years and read everything that was ever composed or written. That's what I'm telling you, and it's all true. I've seen everything, and I know everything." "Poetry?" cried the learned man. "Oh, yes, she's often in recluse in big cities. Poetry. Yes, I saw her for one brief moment, but I had sleep in my eyes. She was standing on the balcony, shimmering like the northern lights." "So tell me, you were on the balcony and you went through the door and then—" "Then I was in the antechamber," said the shadow. "It was in the antechamber you were always sitting there looking at. There were no candles. It was a kind of twilight, but one door after another stood open to a long row of rooms and halls, and all of them were brightly lit. It would have been killed by light if I had gone right in to see the maiden, but I was level-headed. I took my time, and that's what you have to do." "And what did you see?" said the learned man. "I saw everything. I'll tell you all about it, but it's not a matter of pride, but as a free man, and considering the talents that I possess, not to mention my good position, my admirable circumstances, I would appreciate it if you would address me in a formal manner." "I beg your pardon?" said the learned man. "It's an old habit, and that's hard to change. You're perfectly right, and I won't forget. But now, sir, tell me everything you saw." "Everything," said the shadow, "because I thought I saw everything and know everything." "What did it look like in the innermost halls?" asked the learned man. "Was it like a green forest? Was it like a holy sanctuary? Were the halls like the starry sky when you stand on top the high mountains?" "Everything was there," said the shadow. "I didn't go to all the way inside, of course. I stayed in the front rooms in the twilight. But that was an excellent place to be. I saw everything, and I know everything. I've been to poetry's court in the antechamber." "But what did you see? Were all the ancient gods walking through the great halls? Were the ancient heroes fighting? Were sweet children playing and talking about their dreams?" "I tell you, I was there, and you must realize that I saw everything there was to see. If you had to come over there, you would not have become a man, but I did. And on top of that, I learned to see my innermost nature, what I was born with, the kinship that I have with poetry. Well, back when I was living with you, I never thought about it. But as you know, whenever the sun came up or the sun went down, I would grow so astoundingly big. In the moonlight, I was almost more distinct than you were. Back then, I didn't understand my nature. In the antechamber, it all became clear to me. I became a human being. I came back out a mature man. But you were no longer in the warm countries. As human beings, I was ashamed to walk around like that. I needed boots, clothing, my whole human facade that makes a person recognizable. I made my way. Well, I'll tell you, since you're not going to put it in any book after all, I made my way under the skirts of the cake wife. That's where I hid. The woman had no idea how much she was hiding. Not until the evening did I go out. I ran through the streets in the moonlight. I stretched myself up a wall. It tickles to be back so wonderfully. I ran up, I ran down, looking in the highest windows, into parlors and garret rooms. I looked where no one else can look. I saw what no one else can see, what no one else ought to see. What an ignoble world it really is. I wouldn't even want to be a man except that being human is considered worthwhile. I saw the most unthinkable things among women, among men, among parents, among the sweet, marvelous children. I saw, said the shadow, what no person should know, but what everyone would like to know. Bad things about their neighbors. If I had written something for a newspaper, people would have read it. Instead, I wrote directly to the person involved. And terror overcame all the towns that I visited. They were so afraid of me. They were also enormously fond of me. The professors made me a professor. The tailors gave me new clothes. I'm very well outfitted. The matter of the mint made coins for me, and the women told me I was quite handsome. That's how I became the man that I am. And now I'll say farewell. Here's my card. I live in the sunny side, and I'm always home when it rains. And then the shadow left. How strange was that, said the learned man. Days and years passed, and then the shadow came back. How's it going, said the shadow. Oh my, said the learned man. I write about the true and the good and the beautiful, but no one wants to hear about such things. I'm in utter despair because I take it all to heart. But I don't, said the shadow. I'm getting fat, and that's what a person should be. Well, you just don't understand the world. It's making you ill. You have to travel. I'm taking a trip this summer. Would you like to come with me? I wouldn't mind having a traveling companion. Would you like to come along as my shadow? It would be a great pleasure to take you with me, and I'll pay for the trip. That's going a bit far, said the learned man. It all depends on how you look at it, said the shadow. It would do you a world of good to travel. If you'll be my shadow, everything on the trip will be free. This has gone far enough, said the learned man. But that's how the world is, said the shadow, and that's how it will always be. And then the shadow left. Things were not going well for the learned man. Sorrow and torment plagued him, and what he said about the true and the good and the beautiful was for most people like tossing roses to a crow. In the end, he was quite ill. You look like a shadow of yourself, people told him, and the learned man would shiver because it made him think. You should go to the spa, said the shadow, who had come to visit him. There's no other choice. I'll take you along for an old visit for, old time's sake. I'll pay for the trip, and you can write up an account and entertain me a bit along the way. I want to go to a spa too. My man has to have a beard. Now, be sensible and accept the offer. We'll travel together as friends. And so they departed. The shadow was the master, and the master was the shadow. They drove together, they rode and walked together, side by side, in front or in back, depending on where the sun stood. The shadow made sure to keep himself in the master's position, and the learned man didn't think much about it. He was such a good-hearted person, and exceedingly gentle and kind. Then one day he said to the shadow, Now that we've become traveling companions, as we have, since we've also grown up together since childhood, shouldn't we drink a toast and call each other by our first names? That would be much more friendly. There's something in what you say, said the shadow, who is now the real master. That's very straightforward and well-meaning of you. So allow me to be just as well-meaning and straightforward. You, as a learned man, undoubtedly know how strange nature can be. Some people can't stand to touch the newsprint without falling ill. Others feel a pain in all their limbs as if a nail scraped against a window pane. I get the same feeling when I hear you using my first name. I feel as if I were being pressed to the ground in my former position with you. As you can see, it's a feeling, not a matter of pride. I can't allow you to use my first name, but I will be happy to address you in the manner and meet you halfway. And so the shadow called his former master by his first name. Things have certainly gone too far, the learned man thought, when I have to use his last name when he calls me by my first, but he had to put up with it. Then they arrived at the spa where many foreigners were staying, including a lovely king's daughter who was suffering from the illness of being able to see too much, and that was quite worrisome. She noticed at once that the man who had arrived was a very different sort of person from all the rest. "They say he's here to make his beard grow, but I can see the real reason. He's not able to cast a shadow." She grew curious, and so she set off for a stroll and began conversing at once with the foreign gentleman. As a daughter of a king, she could come as straight to the point, and so she said, "Your illness is that you're not able to cast a shadow." "Your Royal Highness must be improving greatly," said the shadow. "I know that your complaint is that you see too much too well, but your sight has weakened. So you must be cured. I have quite a remarkable shadow. Don't you see that man who's always accompanying me? Other people have an ordinary shadow, but I'm not fond of the ordinary. People often give their servants finer livery than they wear themselves, and it's the same fashion. I've dressed up my shadow as a human being. As you can see, I've even given him his own shadow. It's very expensive, but I like having something unique." So he's lying. "What?" thought the princess. "Is it true that I've actually recovered? This spa is the best of them all. These days the waters have such wondrous powers. But I'm not going to leave, because things are so amusing here right now. This stranger is very much to my liking. If only his beard won't start growing, because then he'll leave." That evening, in the grand ballroom, the king's daughter danced with the shadow. She was light on her feet, but he was even lighter. She had never had such a dance partner before. She told him what country she came from, and he knew that country. He had been there, but back then she hadn't been at home. He had peeked in the windows upstairs and down. He had seen both one thing and another, and so he could reply to the king's daughter and drop hints that made her quite amazed. He must be the wisest man in the whole world. Her respect for his knowledge grew, and when they started dancing again, she fell in love. The shadow was well aware of this because she was practically looking straight through him. Then they danced again, and she was about to speak of it, but she was level-headed. She thought about her country and the kingdom and all the people she would rule. "He's certainly a wise man," she said to herself. "That's good. And a lovely dancer. That's good too. But I wonder if he has deeper knowledge. That's just as important. He will have to be questioned." And so, little by little, she began to ask him about the most difficult things, questions that she herself could have never answered. And the shadow gave her a peculiar look. "So you can't answer my questions?" said the king's daughter. "They belong to my childhood lessons," said the shadow. "I think even my shadow over there by the door could answer them." "Your shadow?" said the king's daughter. "That would be highly unusual." "Well, I'm not saying he definitely could," said the shadow, "but I think he can. He's been accompanying me for so many years and listening, so I think he can. But if your Royal Highness will permit, I must bring it to your attention that he is so proud of passing for a human that if he's going to be in a good mood, and he will have to, do that in order to answer the questions properly. Then he has to be treated like a person." "Oh, I like that," said the king's daughter. And so she went over there to the learned man near the door. She talked to him about the sun and the moon, and about people both outwardly and inwardly. And he replied both wisely and well. "What a man he must be to have such a wise shadow," she thought. "It would be a sheer blessing for my people and my kingdom if I chose him as my consort. And that's what I'm going to do." They soon came to an agreement, the king's daughter and the shadow, but no one was to know about it until she returned home to her own kingdom. "No one, not even my shadow," said the shadow. And of course he had his own reasons for that. Then they came to the country where the king's daughter ruled whenever she was home. "Listen here, my good friend," said the shadow to the learned man. "Now that I've become as happy and as powerful as anyone can be, I want to do something special for you. You will live with me in the palace, drive me in my royal carriage, and have 100,000 rigsdaler a year. But you must let everyone call you Shadow, and you mustn't say that you've been a human being. And once a year, when I'm sitting on the balcony in the sunshine holding an audience, you must lie at my feet, as the shadow should. I have to tell you that I'm marrying the king's daughter. Tonight the wedding takes place." "Now things have gone much too far," said the learned man. "I refuse. I refuse to do it. That would mean betraying the whole country and the king's daughter, too. I'm going to tell the whole story that I'm a human being and you're the shadow. That you're just masquerading. No one will believe you, said the shadow. Be sensible or I'll call the guard. I'm going straight to the king's daughter, said the learned man. But I'm going first, said the shadow, and you're going to jail. And that's what happened. Because the sentries obeyed the man who was to be the husband of the king's daughter. You're shaking, said the king's daughter when the shadow came to her. Has something happened? You mustn't be ill this evening, now that we're going to celebrate our wedding. I have been through the most horrible experience anyone could have had, said the shadow. Imagine. Well, I suppose a poor shadow brain can't stand very much. Imagine. My shadow has gone mad. He thinks he's a human being, and then I just imagine that I'm his shadow. How horrible, said the princess. He is locked up, isn't he? Yes, he is. I'm afraid he'll never come to his senses. Poor shadow, said the princess. How unhappy he is. It would be true kindness to free him from his meager life that he has left. Now that I think about it, I believe it's going to be necessary to do away with him in all this secrecy. How painful that is, said the shadow. After all, he was a loyal servant. And then he uttered what sounded like a sigh. What a noble character you have, said the king's daughter. That evening, the whole city was lit up. The cannons were fired, boom, and the soldiers presented arms. Now that was a wedding. The king's daughter and the shadow came out to the balcony to be seen by all and receive another round of hurrahs. The learned man heard none of it, because by then they had taken his life. And that was the shadow. Okay. Well, that happened. That was an interesting moral. It's definitely more dialogue than I've ever seen from some of these fairy tales. It's definitely dark. If I were to glean a moral from it, it would be careful who you trust, even if they're, someone you think is very close to you, because people can change. And be wary of giving your power over to someone. Because everyone has their own power. Everyone has their own, sense of self. And when you start, allowing people to take your sense of self and get away with things that you're uncomfortable with, you're letting them take a part of your identity. So it was a very good story, even though it was very sad. Either way. Thank you so much for joining me for another Storytime with Sid. It's been great seeing you guys again. And I hope that you're all staying happy, healthy, and safe. So have a wonderful rest of your day. And I'll see you next time.